It is a pleasure to welcome back to the Society Richard Wilding, who last spoke to us 2 years ago on Kurdistan. Today, his subject is Saudi Arabia and particularly the heritage of the kingdom, illustrated through the huge diversity of traditional costume. His talk today is a product of 10 years' work with the Mansoujat Foundation in Jeddah. Mansoujat is a project set up by a group of Saudi women, one of whom we will also hear from later, and a link to their website will be in the chat channel shortly. Jointly, they have worked to document traditional costumes and shed a new light on the kingdom's great diversity of regional and tribal identities and the influences that have been left by centuries of trade and pilgrimage through the region. Together, Richard and the Mansoujat Foundation have published the results of their long research this year in the book Traditional Costumes of Saudi Arabia, and a link to that will also be in the chat channel shortly. Richard will be joined after his presentation by Hamida Alireza, one of the 9 founding members of Mansoujat. Please welcome Richard. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to start by introducing the Mansoujat Foundation. Mansoujat was founded in 2000 by a group of Saudi Arabian women from Jeddah who share a passion for the costumes and heritage of Saudi Arabia. And over the past 21 years, Mansoujat has collected approximately 1,400 costume items, many of which have required extensive restoration. It's been a long-held ambition of Mansoujat to produce a publication that shows the diversity of costume in the collection and examines their social, geographical, and cultural context. The production and editing of the book, now published by ACC Art Books, has been a challenge because there were few resources available in previous books on the subject. Classifying and documenting the costumes has entailed years of research, field trips and consultation with both academics and local experts. Mansoujat decided that rather than expecting a single writer from outside the kingdom to cover all regions, it would be better to work with specialists for each region who would be more familiar with the local history, culture, and traditions. And organizing this book into logical chapters has also been a great challenge. In some instances, costumes had to be grouped by tribe, and in others by geographical location. The geographical coverage of the book is determined by the scope of the Mansoujat collection itself. As the costumes have been collected from various donations and field trips, the geographical distribution of the collection is uneven. So some regions of the kingdom are sparsely represented, while others are much more strongly represented. And we hope that this book will form an important introduction to the costumes and heritage of Saudi Arabia and inspire others to continue and expand on its preservation and research efforts. I'd like to describe to you the 2 main components of the Mansoujat collection. Firstly, we have what we call the walk collection. These are costumes which are either in a poorer condition or have been superseded by other better examples for a particular tribe or region. And the walk costume allow us to actually wear the costumes for live events and put on displays like the one you see here at the V&A in London in 2007. And the other component is what we call the primary collection. And these are the best examples for each tribe or region. They are fragile, in many cases too small to put on people. And so for displaying the primary collection, we use mannequins. Unlike some museums, we've not been able to use the T-bar to display costumes because most of them include a headdress, which wouldn't be possible to include on a T-bar. So as I said, the costume collection was sourced partly from well-known costume dealers, but many of the items were actually picked up in bazaars such as this one. You can see here a wonderful old shop in Bahah with a costume sitting between various stuffed animals. And here in the souk in Najran, you can see some fine silver jewelry being sold along with some eggs. So I'll briefly describe the geography of the Arabian Peninsula. We have here a map showing the two great deserts, the Rub al-Khali in the south, the empty quarter, which is the largest sand desert in the world, and then the Food Desert in the north. We have Najd in the center, and running down the western side of the Arabian Peninsula, we have the Hijaz Mountains, which run in a spine all the way from the Gulf of Aqaba down to Yemen. This satellite view shows the size of the great Rub al-Khali and also the ridge of mountains running down the west of the Arabian Peninsula, which we call the Hijaz. And the process of producing this book has been a long one. We realized early on that we needed to put the costumes in the context of their geography, climate, because these are so important in defining the style of costume and the materials. So we set out to do a series of research trips, which meant traveling into fairly remote parts of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, down to Najran in the south and around the Hudheyl and Juba and Tamar in the north, and also include trips out into the Rub al-Khali. And this demonstrates the great diversity of landscape that we see in Saudi Arabia. We have wonderful oases, and we also have incredible archaeological sites, such as Madain Salah, shown here, the Nabatean tombs carved into rocks, similar to its twin city of Petra in Jordan. And the depictions of costume in Arabia go back a long way. We see here a petroglyph carved into rocks at Bir Hima in the south of Saudi Arabia, showing a man in a pair of what look like shorts and also carrying a sword. And here from a site near Hudheyl in the north, a stele depicting a man wearing a dagger, which can still be seen, particularly in parts of Najran in the south. And this fragment showing a costume on a man from Qaryat al-Fal. This map, a beautiful map from 1883, shows the Muslim world as it was at that time. And we can see here the shaded area depicting Indonesia in the east, across to Morocco in the west, and the sea routes which took pilgrims into the Arabian Peninsula to Jeddah in the Red Sea, the port for Mecca. And this is an interesting illustration of the way in which the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage, brought travelers from wide afield, all of whom brought influence into the Arabian Peninsula in terms of costume and fabrics, materials, styles of embroidery. And we'll see examples of these in my talk. And then within the Arabian Peninsula itself, this map shows the Hajj pilgrimage routes converging on Mecca in the south. We have from left to right the Egyptian caravan starting in Cairo, the Syrian caravan from Damascus, the caravan starting at Kufa, just south of Baghdad, and one crossing the Arabian Peninsula via Riyadh, starting in the port of Uqair. There were also caravans from Yemen in the south, and indeed many pilgrims arriving by sea into the port of Jeddah for the short journey on to Mecca. As I said at the beginning, the Mansujat book does not cover all tribes of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, of which there are dozens. Indeed, there are important tribes such as the Utayba and the Bili, which are not represented at all. And we also have several tribes clustered very close together, of which we have many costumes. So I'll start the journey through the tribes with the Thaqeef. The Thaqeef tribe inhabit the area around Taif, which is highlighted here above Mecca. And this is a region on top of the mountain escarpment, the Sarawat Mountains. And this picture was taken on the road up from Mecca to Taif. It's an amazing experience by road. And in the space of just 40 minutes, the temperature can easily drop by 20 degrees centigrade. And once one reaches the top of the mountains, the climate changes completely. We have here the Taif rose grown in abundance, and this is used in the distillery of a perfume. This example costume from the Thaqeef tribe, taken in the 1960s, shows that the costumes were still worn in the field at that time. And we see here a very similar costume from the Mansujat collection. The headdress is not just one item, but is in fact many layers, one on top of the other, starting with the kargush, shown here, and then the misfa, which is wrapped around the neck and then pulled over the head. This hides the neck and the lower part of the face. And we see here an example of a woman in Taif wearing this part of the headdress. And finally, the kinar, which is worn on top, and this is held straight along the top with the addition of an asa or stick, which it gives it this flat top. And a more simple garment worn by the men. I should just say here that the tobe that I'm referring to throughout the presentation is a garment which is worn both by women and men, and indeed children. And I'm also going to show some examples of jewelry. The jewelry is not necessarily distinctly attached to any one tribe. This example of a silver necklace incorporates coins. These are the Maori Teresa coin, which is highly prized for its high silver content. And it was used for many centuries throughout the Arab world as a de facto currency. Another tribe inhabiting the area around Taif are the Hudheyl. And the Hudheyli costumes incorporate tie-dyed patterns, as we see here, and also note the patterned pantaloons worn underneath the tobe. And we see here in this photograph very similar trousers and tie-dyed tobe being worn in the 1930s. The Bayram is a headdress shown here with the costume and here flat to show off the wonderful patterning and geometry. Moving south, we come down to an area known as the Tihama, which is the coastal plain along the Red Sea below Mecca. And this region is inhabited by the Jahdaly tribe. We see here in an historical illustration a Jahdaly woman in the center and an equivalent costume from the Mansujat collection. Again, we see here the headdress with the Hassa stick along the front, and also silver beads falling down from the headdress, which were possibly worn to shield the face from flies. And another historical photograph of a Jahdaly woman here on the right. And note the headdress and also the historical band in the center, and also the bands along the bottom of the tobe. These headdresses, being made from silver beads, are, as you can imagine, very heavy indeed. And in fact, the mannequins which we used to display these costumes had to be reinforced with scaffolding to stand up to the weight of these headdresses. The Bani Saad tribe inhabit the top of the mountain below Thaqeef. This is the original village of Bani Saad, now sadly abandoned. And this is an area known for its grazing of sheep. And also here we have an example of a beehive, which is in a hollowed out tree trunk. And the Bani Saad are known for their manufacture of silver beads. And here is an example of a woman making these beads. She does this by heating up a silver metal alloy in a stove. She separates out small beads of metal, and she then uses the thorn of an acacia tree, shown here. These extremely long thorns, very dangerous to touch, although the camels love eating them. They eat them like crisps. And she uses this thorn to pierce a hole through the bead. You can see the finished beads here on the left, and the handmade beads are beautifully smooth and rounded, unlike machine-made beads, which are much cruder and rougher. And here we see an example of the beads actually being sewn into a costume of the Bani Saad. The Bani Saad headdresses are remarkable. This particular costume includes Jadil belt and the Matawiya headdress, and the radaya worn over the top, including the Hassa stick to keep it straight along the top. And in front of the radaya, and worn as an ornament exclusively by brides, we have the matawiya, which are these two hanging sets of jewelry hanging either side of the face. Bani Malik and Harith are two closely related tribes, again along the top of the Sarawak mountain range. This photograph shows the kind of environment. We have here the prickly pear cactus. And the Bani Malik are known for their yellow material and also their use of glass beads rather than the silver beads used elsewhere. And the examples here of jewelry include small pieces of colored glass along the top of this silver necklace. And the colored glass is actually taken from recycled car lights. This shows the quality of the workmanship that goes into this beautiful jewelry. and a silver anklet, which includes bells, which would have made a sound when worn by shepherdesses in the fields. So moving on to Al-Bahah. Al-Bahah is an area that straddles the mountain range, including the beautiful towers shown here. In fact, Al-Bahah is known as the region of 1001 towers. And these watchtowers would have originally been used to protect livestock and crops, but also were used during inter-tribal conflict. And below the escarpment, we have the village of Thaqeef, which is built on a natural marble outcrop, thankfully recently restored. The triangular motifs you see here are quite common to Al-Bahah architecture, and we can also see the same triangles repeated in the old doors of Al-Bahah and reflected in the design of their costume. The woolen jackets shown here, known as Madara, are an indication of the colder climate up in the mountains of Al-Bahah. And these sandals are made from recycled car tires. Asir, in the south of Saudi Arabia, translates from the Arabic for difficult. And indeed, it's always been a very inaccessible area. In fact, the first Westerner to penetrate Asir was not until the 1950s. And you can see here a road which is climbing the mountain escarpment, and it takes around an hour to reach from the top to the bottom. And the architecture of Asir includes dry stone walling, shown here in Rij al-Alma village. And the technique includes the use of slate, which is packed tightly between larger stones. You can see it very clearly on this stone tower, which also includes geometric patterns made from quartz stone. The man here is creating these small fragments in order to pack tightly to act as a form of cement between the larger stones. Inside the houses, the painting is done by the women, and this cat painting, or gut painting as I should say, is a beautiful, colourful interior, which is then reflected in the costumes, which show flowers and also include straw hats, which are still quite commonly worn. The nut over the back was worn to protect the wearer when carrying wood and other heavy loads. And the straw hat is shown here in the market of Abha, the regional center of Asir. And the woman here is making flower garlands. These are created from various herbs. They have a beautiful smell, and these are worn by the so-called flower men of Asir. And these wreaths of flowers are worn not for the benefit of tourists, but as an important form of marketing, because these men are selling honey, and this is a way of showing the quality of the flowers that have gone into making their honey. So it's a form of advertising, I suppose. And here we see the honey market in Asir. This honeycomb is truly amazing. I've never tasted honey like it anywhere else. And the wreaths of flowers are also worn by the women of Asir. And this costume is complemented by the straw bag. The Qahtan tribe are also in that same region, and they're known for their colorfully painted houses. Originally, the floors of these houses would also have been covered with alfalfa, but this is now replaced with green paint and carpet. And the architecture of the Qahtan is very interesting. It includes these skyscraper-like towers built out of mud, and the slate is not just for decoration. This is also designed so that when it rains, and I've seen torrential rain here, it means that the rain drips from one row of slate to the next and doesn't wash away the mud walls. And inside the houses too, we have beautiful, colorful reception rooms. The costumes too are colorful, and this particular tobe also includes a rope belt, which is over 6 meters long and is wound continuously around the waist and then tied in a knot. And in the far south of Saudi Arabia, we have Jazan, a region on the coast, which also incorporates various islands in the Red Sea. And we have in Jazan peacock motif, which is repeated quite frequently here in the jewelry, also here in a headdress. And we have wonderful floral patterns also shown here in the architecture at the palace ruins in Sabia. The dress shown here would have been worn for special occasions, and it includes a headdress made from jasmine flowers, which would have also emitted a beautiful fragrance. And the man shown here from Faifa is wearing wreaths of flower in his hair, but unlike those in Asir, the flowers here are much looser and flopped over the longer hair of the wearer. The Yam tribe inhabit an area around the town of Najran on the border with Yemen, but also would have inhabited the area on the edges of the Ruba Khali. And the architecture of Najran, shown here with the mountains in the background, also nearby the site of Al-Aqdud, which was a town originally built in the 1st century BC to 1st century CE. And it's known for a story which is also mentioned in the Quran of a Jewish ruler from nearby Yemen who persecuted the Christian population of the town as it was then by throwing them into a burning ditch. And in fact, archaeological evidence have actually supported this story. And the carving shown here and the finely dressed stones illustrate the wealthy history of Al-Aqdud, because it sat on the incense route up from Yemen, and it was the point at which 2 different routes then split, with one continuing up the Red Sea coast to Egypt and the Levant, and the other one heading towards the Gulf, towards Baghdad. And this meant that the inhabitants of Al-Aqdud could impose a tax on any passing trade, which made them very wealthy. And here we're venturing out into the Ruba Khali, a truly amazing place, and the site of Bir Hima, where we find petroglyphs carved into the rocks dating back to 2500 BC. We see here this writing is Old South Arabian, one of the early Semitic languages. And these petroglyphs include our friend here in the shorts, and also tribal markers, which would have been used to delineate tribal territory, and a magnificent hunting scene shown here. And one of the interesting things about these petroglyphs is that they illustrate how much the climate has changed, because they include depictions of cattle, an ostrich shown here, a lion, an ibex. And the yam costumes from this region are mainly in black, but include wonderful silver jewelry shown here. And in the headdress, rings were added for decoration. And the ring shown here would have been made from silver, with the red probably coming from coral. Najd is the region of central Arabia, centered on the capital of Saudi Arabia, Riyadh. These ruins are at Ad-Dariyah, which was the capital of the first Saudi dynasty, which was destroyed by the Ottomans in 1818. And we see here photographs of Ad-Dariyah as it was before a recent restoration. And the founder of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz Al Saud, and when Al Saud founded the modern Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932, he moved the capital to the present-day Riyadh. The costumes of Najd indicate much more of an influence from the East. We have fabrics with an Indian feel, much more finer, transparent materials with heavy gold embroidery. And this particular tur tobe has sleeves which span 5 meters from cuff to cuff. And the pink shown at the back is known as a tikrasa, which is an additional garment to ensure that when the sleeves were lifted, the legs would still be covered. And this historical photograph shows a tur tobe remarkably similar to the one in the Mansujat collection. And this men's digla, an overcoat, would have been worn for warmth, because in the Najd, it still gets very cold at night. And this outfit was worn not just in Najd, but also in the eastern provinces and in the north. The jewelry of Najd is quite different to that of the rest of the kingdom that we've seen so far. It incorporates turquoise, coral, and pearls. And we now reach the far east of Saudi Arabia, the area centered on the Hassa oasis, the largest natural oasis in the world. And here the dhows, the Al-Qatif on the coast. And this eastern province, Tobe, is made of silk, and it's worn both in Najd and in the eastern province, and again is very heavily influenced from India and the east. And in fact, this outfit is known as the Dara'a Hind, an indication of its Indian origins. And so we reach the north of Arabia, Saudi Arabia, the region around the city of Hudheyl. This photograph was taken inside the women's souk in Hudheyl. And Hudheyl was known for its horses, We see here a petroglyph showing a horse-drawn chariot. And here we see Lady Anne Blunt, who visited Hudheyl in 1879 in search of Arabian horses to take back to the Crabbet stud in England. And in fact, the horses which she took to England are the ancestors of most modern thoroughbred Arabian racehorses. And this men's outfit reflects a description made by Lady Anne Blunt in her diary, in which she describes the Emir of Hudheyl, Ibn Rashid, and she described him as very distinguished in appearance, clothed as he was in purple and fine linen. So we're now returning to the western side of Saudi Arabia, to the north of the Hijaz and the Rashaidah tribe. And the Rashaidah inhabit the areas around the Najd desert, the second great desert of Arabia. Here we see a desert mihrab used for finding the direction of prayer towards Mecca, and a Rashaidah tobe incorporating these bands of geometry down the front of the tobe. And on the back of the headdress, the kinna incorporates these cross motifs. And one of the interesting things about the Rashaidah tribe is that they were originally from the Arabian Peninsula, but in the middle of the 19th century, tribal rivalry forced them to emigrate to Ethiopia and Eritrea. And much later on, they were then encouraged to move back, and they brought with them various influences from Africa. And the wonderful silver alloy bracelet here. And the Sulaym tribe inhabit the same region. The well shown here at Tema, which is an oasis town in the Najd, dates back to the 6th century BCE. And in fact, it's been lost completely several times in its history in sandstorms, where it's been covered up completely. And it was most recently unearthed in the 1950s and then restored. And you can see around the top of the well a series of wheels which would have been used by camels to draw water. And this allowed 60 camels to simultaneously pull up barrels of water. And these were used to irrigate the date groves around Tema. And the outfits incorporate, as you see here, a headdress that includes coins in a ridge in front of the nose. And we also see on top of the head an igile, which is also used elsewhere by men to weigh down the headdress, to stop it blowing off. The Harb tribe cover the area which is crossed by those trade routes which I mentioned earlier, the trade route traversing up the Red Sea coast. And here we see examples of caravan coming from Syria. And these were later replaced by the Hijaz Railway, which was constructed by the Ottomans in the early years of the 20th century. And this was the railway which was later sabotaged by groups encouraged by T. Lawrence. And this costume incorporates a baby carrier shown here. And we see various examples of burqas. The burqa for girls shown here had loops which would have been simply worn around the ears, and other types of burqa were worn by pilgrims, by widows. And here a very ornate woman's burqa with coins down the front. And finally, we reach the Hijaz cities of Medina, Jeddah, and Mecca. And although these cities are geographically distinct, they share similar styles in costume, both with men and women. And starting with Medina, we see here the city walls surrounding the Prophet's mosque. And here the Al-Manakah encampment, which was the departure and arrival point for those caravans. And architecture in Medina, which is very similar to the historic architecture which survives in Al-Balad in Jeddah. And then Jeddah, which was the port city for Mecca, and the arrival of pilgrims from far and wide, bringing with them much influence in terms of costume and also trade. And here we see the old center of Jeddah known as Al-Balad. And one of the interesting things about the architecture in Jeddah is that the stone is actually coral, which is mined from the sea around Jeddah. And Al-Balad is also known for its beautifully carved doors, patterns, floral patterns, which we also see reflected in the costumes. And then Mecca, shown here, the panorama with the mosque and Kaaba in the center. And as I said, the women's costumes are similar throughout the Hijaz cities. And I think this is an indication of how different the settled peoples were from the tribal or the Bedouin peoples of elsewhere. The materials used reflect a very different lifestyle and also demonstrate more influence from far-flung places. This particular woman's costume incorporates a burqa shown here raised as it would have been worn in private, but the burqa could then be brought down over the front of the face when out in public. We see here the lace patterning on the back. And this woman's outfit incorporates various floral patterns, and it's known as the Darir and Manthur, meaning scattered, with the floral patterns scattered over the dress and the headdress. And this is a bridal outfit which includes fresh roses around the bodice. And a boy's costume in this photograph from 1937, and here in a very similar outfit from the Mansoujat collection. And finally, the men's costumes of the Hijaz cities. And these are interesting because we can still find these costumes and various forms of headdress being worn in Al-Balad today. There are many different headdress with names indicating their various origins of the Kashmiri and so on. And we see here the Kamar belt being worn, and also a sarong known as a futa. And the iconic Umama Alfi, which was at one time so ubiquitous in Jeddah that it was even depicted on top of one of the city gates. and these caps known as kafiyah, which can still be seen worn on the streets in Al-Balad, in the marketplace, and shown here in this rather wonderful group of men in Al-Balad. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'd just like to emphasize that even though I've shown a great number of pictures today, it's really just a fraction of what we have in the book. And of course, there is all the wonderful research which has been undertaken by our writers. And I would encourage you to get a copy from the publishers or from Mansujat direct in Saudi Arabia. Contact details are shown here. And I'd like to finish by saying that this has been very much a group effort on the part of Mansujat and our trustees and members. I'd also like to thank people who have supplied photography, historical photographs that we've used in the book. And I'm very pleased to say that my Mansujat colleague, Hamida Alireza, one of the co-founders of Mansujat, will be joining me now to answer any questions from the audience. So thank you all for listening, and please do ask us anything you would like to know about what I've been showing. I must emphasize again that we are not costumes experts. We are people who are passionate about these and passionate about the heritage and costumes of Saudi Arabia. So thank you all for listening. And Michael, I think it's back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. I mean, wonderful, wonderful images, both of the costumes and of the context of the costumes, if I can put it like that. Absolutely fascinating. I had a question of my own to start with, but I mean, it has in fact been asked in very similar terms by a lot of people already. So I will ask that. Could I just say, please, members of the audience, if you have questions to ask, please use the Q&A button on your screens. It's easier to find the questions there than if you use the chat button. But the first question, and one that has been raised by a number of people, is about the fabrics. First of all, what fabrics are being used here? And some of it is cotton, clearly, but presumably cotton was not used historically. Where do the fabrics come from? Are they woven locally? Presumably originally they were, but are they still? Traditionally, how were they dyed and what was used for dyeing? Dyeing is a process that uses a lot of water, among other things, which is famously in short supply in much of Saudi Arabia. So how does all that work? These are immensely elaborate garments, clearly intended to indicate prestige as well as functionality. What's the background here in the actual making of them?
I'll pass on to Hamida in a minute, but I'll just say firstly that I think that's a very interesting question. I think in a way the scarcity is a sign of just how important these costumes were, because they were a sign of how much the wearer had actually invested in them financially. I think costumes and jewelry were also a way of preserving wealth, in the sense that the jewelry was a way of wearing one's wealth in a way that was sort of secure and couldn't be taken. I think that when it comes to things like materials, the fact that a material was difficult to source in a way was a symbol of how important the costumes were to the wearer. But Hamida, I'll pass on to you for.
Well, I agree with you. Most of the costumes we have are actually cotton. And they distinguish themselves with the embroidery. It's not the fabric. It's the embroidery that distinguishes one tribe from the other, and the way they use their stitching and colors. And beading, of course.
Fascinating. I mean, the Victoria Schofield has asked a question that was also on my mind, and perhaps I can ask you, which is, how were these extremely elaborate garments kept clean, or cleaned if they ceased to be clean? It's a mundane question, but a pretty important one, I guess.
I don't know.
With a lot of work, I suspect.
We do know that a lot of them were recycled. I mean, there are some costumes that show 3 different embroidery qualities, and always the oldest embroidery finer than the one after it. But obtaining them, they were mostly not clean.
I think that one of the obvious influences on the style of costume and material is the circumstance in which they were worn, and you find with the nomadic tribes that you have much heavier costume, whereas in obviously the more urban dwellers you have a much finer kind of material. But I'm not sure what would have been used for cleaning.
Just following on from the sort of question of decoration that Hamida indicated as a sort of distinguishing feature more than anything. Julian Campbell has asked, to what extent are any of the patterns symbolic? I mean, coins pretty clearly are an indication of wealth, however attractive they might be in their own right. But are there other elements that have symbolic qualities to them? I mean, I noticed, for example, that triangles appeared, you mentioned specifically at one point, Richard, on decorations on the doors, but also I noticed they appeared in some of the tobes as well. I'm just looking at my own notes. In the Rashaidah Tribe, for example, are those of some symbolic significance?
Unfortunately, there probably were symbolic references, but the people today are not aware of them. It's been lost in translation, as far as we can tell.
And so then, from Heba Barakat, a question that might be relevant there is, are there any historical texts describing the costumes prior to the 19th century? How far back does the written record of these things go?
You mean textual evidence in Arabic?
Yes.
In Arabic. The Arabic that I have come across personally is mostly genealogical, and it refers to where people live. There isn't much describing, especially women. I mean, there are descriptions of what the Prophet wore, but nothing that is reflected today.
Let me sort of stick with the sort of the heritage aspect here. One questioner notes that traditional weaving of Al Sadu in 2020 was inscribed as on the list of intangible cultural heritage. And the questioner asks, does the Mansujat Foundation or any other entity hope to do the same with these costumes? What more can be done to preserve this heritage?
That's a very good question.
I think that I suppose there's two aspects to that. One is preserving the collection itself, and thankfully we've got the collection catalogued. It's safely stored, and we've hopefully secured its future as a collection. And then there's the wider issue of how do we educate and promote the wider public. I think there's two aspects to that. There's the importance of promoting the costumes to the outside world to demonstrate that Saudi Arabia has this wonderful, colorful, rich tradition, which very few outsiders are aware of. And I think there's the other aspect, which is actually educating people at home within Saudi Arabia, because many people have lost touch with these traditions, and younger people are growing up in regions and within tribes not really understanding this heritage. There was one example I showed in my talk of a young woman in Thaqeef wearing an outfit, and she wouldn't have known how to wear, she wouldn't have known how to assemble the various components. It was only because her mother was there and she had had it passed on to her, and she was able to help. And I think this is one of the problems with intangible cultural heritage. It relies on a continuance, a passing on from one generation to the next. And over the last 70 years, we've seen tremendous change in Saudi Arabia. It's changed beyond recognition since the discovery of oil and all the changes that has brought. And this means that within 2 generations, this entire tradition, this heritage, was in danger of being lost, not just the costumes themselves, but the understanding of how they fitted together. And so I think that's one of the very important aims with Mansujat, to try and educate people within Saudi Arabia about this rich tradition.
Well, hopefully making the costumes visible also would allow researchers to maybe find the motifs and what they represent from poetry or text.
I'm very interested by the fact that, as you said, the cultural knowledge has been lost or is being lost on the way. The comparison that comes to my mind is Japan, where I spent a couple of years a long time ago, and where, of course, traditional costumes are also immensely elaborate, complicated to put on, and young women learn from their mothers how to wear kimono, but it has not been lost, and these garments are still worn relatively routinely. Of course, in a day-to-day job, people wear Western clothing, but there would, I guess, be very few young Japanese women who did not know how to put on a kimono for a special occasion. Whereas it sounds as though the Saudi experience has been rather more extreme in terms of the loss of knowledge. Is that, do you think, a product of, I mean, you implied, Richard, that it was a product of the rapidity of change and the extent of change.
Modernization.
Yeah. And Japan went through that, of course, but somewhat more slowly. I mean, are there other factors here? I mean, obviously, these are garments that are at least generally better suited for special occasions than for herding sheep, even if they were sometimes worn in the fields. Is there no inclination to bring this back as part of a tradition?
They're very time consuming to make. It takes them typically a year per tobe to make. And they're complicated to wear.
I think that inevitably things go in and out of fashion, and I suppose that it happens all over the world that one generation sees something from a certain era as being something they don't want to necessarily be associated with. And I think every society goes through this process of sort of owning something and disowning something. And I think that's just something that hopefully we've now gone through one cycle of that. It's the same in the UK with architecture. I remember, you know, in previous generations, Victorian architecture was very unfashionable, and then 1960s architecture became very unfashionable, and then suddenly it's come back into fashion. And I think the same thing happens with other forms of heritage. I hope with something like the costumes, where it may have been seen as something that was almost a reminder of a past that wasn't necessarily in tune with what people were looking for in a modernizing country. I hope that now Saudi Arabia is, you know, in many ways superseded the West in modernizing, that maybe they will, and they certainly are, looking back more with more pride. And I think this is happening. We're seeing a wonderful renaissance with opening of museums and other heritage in Saudi Arabia. So I think that this is happening.
Yeah, I mean, another question that arises is what, if anything, is the attitude of Saudi authority here? I mean, I have in mind, for example, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, wearing of the fez in Turkey was prohibited, and England has its own parts in this sort of thing, in banning the wearing of the kilt in Scotland at a certain time, because these garments had political significance, as well as, or implied some sort of political significance, as well as utilitarian one. I mean, is there any? I didn't get any sense from what either of you were saying that this was a factor in Saudi Arabia, but I just asked the question: is there any sort of sign of that?
No, it's just, I think, mostly practicality. And they're handmade. Well, you saw, imagine how many beads there were on that one outfit, other than the embroidery.
I think that the diversity of tribal identities and geographical identities is now something that's being recognized and supported, and I think this is a very encouraging sign, and I think that the interesting thing will be what happens now with the push towards tourism in Saudi Arabia, so that these forms of heritage will be seen as cultural attractions, which will be one of the appeals, I think, in people traveling to Saudi Arabia, to find these sort of forms of living heritage. And I mean, certainly from my perspective as an outsider working in Saudi Arabia now for many years, it's been incredible seeing the change that's taken place within those years, both in terms of appreciation of heritage and support for heritage projects. So I think this is very encouraging.
One of the audience has raised a question about the buildings, which I know is not the core subject of your talk, but she asks if you can talk a bit more about the materials used in the architecture. Mud brick is common, of course, coral very unusual, but I mean, is it right to assume that modern buildings use modern materials, or are there still some of the traditional materials in use in domestic architecture?
There are wonderful architects working in Saudi Arabia now who are inspired by the past and the past traditions in terms of materials and techniques, and this can be seen in examples. I've certainly seen wonderful examples in Jeddah of this. I think that the other thing is that some forms of traditional architecture survive longer than others. So we see those stone towers, for instance, in Bahah, although some of them are semi-ruinous, they've survived for a long time because they're built from stone. The region, the old district of Jeddah, was for many years in a very poor state of repair, and thankfully this has now been taken up by the authorities, and that's seen a real renaissance. If one visits Al Balad now, there are many beautiful buildings which have been restored, which are now being put to use as cafes and cultural attractions. So it's certainly being taken seriously more than it was. You saw in the pictures the village of Thaqeef in Al Bahah, which was until relatively recently ruined and abandoned. This is all being restored beautifully. So likewise, Rijal Alma. In fact, Rijal Alma was restored as a community project by the local inhabitants, and then it was taken up as a project by the Saudi Commission for Tourism and Heritage. So there have been really great examples in recent years. Others may be less successful in terms of restoration, but certainly some very, very good examples.
Coming back to the costumes themselves, two sort of related, well, I mean, they may be related questions. I'll leave you to tell us whether they're related or not. But Sheila Russell asks, does anyone make traditional clothes now? She notes you can buy copies in the markets in Al Bahah, but they're often made in China or India. Is anyone making them in a traditional way in Saudi Arabia? And perhaps related to that, Scott Redford, who clearly knows a great deal more about fabrics and dyes than I do, says, I noted a lot of chemical dyes. I assume that local knowledge of vegetable and mineral dyes has, as Hamida put it, got lost in translation. Is that right?
Hamida?
Yes. In answer to the dyers, the last of the dyers we met, he had retired. It was about almost 20 years ago. In Taif, they used to dye, definitely, but then everything went to the chemical dyes.
And on the question of whether anyone is still making these?
The simpler city ones are being replicated locally to various standards of competence.
On the designs themselves, I mean, Sophia Lambert here, well, has two comments. First of all, she mentions that in terms of cleaning garments, that similarly elaborate costumes in England in past centuries were simply not cleaned. They were looked at after carefully, but they weren't cleaned except for being sort of sponged down a bit occasionally. But she asks a specific question. She noticed, as did I, that some of the sleeves on these costumes were quite short. And were these worn outside or only within the home?
The short sleeves were to allow for these silver bracelets.
Uh-huh. You're going to make space somehow, right? So they would still have been worn outside then, would they?
Yes.
Right. Interesting. And coming back, I don't know what lies behind this this question, but are there any tribal costumes that are no longer worn at all in modern times? Are these lost?
For the women, I don't think any women wear them,
right.
Other than the elderly, who just haven't changed.
Yeah, so it's actually almost the reverse. It's not a question of which ones aren't worn, it's a question of which ones are, and that's actually very few in real life. I think that many families have examples of pieces of costume which they have stored away, but in terms of actually wearing them as a day-to-day outfit, or even for special occasions, I think that would be very rare. I think it's been nice to see women wearing costumes that are inspired by some of those old designs, and you'll find that any event involving Mansujat, the Mansujat members will be wearing tobes that are, inspired or are based on the designs of specific costumes. But I think in terms of within tribal areas themselves, you wouldn't find, if you went out into the countryside, you wouldn't find women wearing the full costumes. You find elements, you find straw hats in Asir, certainly, but not the full costumes.
Okay.
Yes,
Well,
I mean, even in the bazaars where they're promoting craft and so on, the few women who still know the embroidery, they'll be wearing regular clothes.
Yeah. We're coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask one last question to both of you, really. It is in relation to the work that you've been doing together towards the book. And the question is, what was the most interesting part of it?
Meeting the people on the trips who still hold on to the traditions and are passionate about having the traditions continued and stay on for the future, for their children and grandchildren.
I think for me, it's been really the whole process of working with a subject which hasn't been really thoroughly looked at before, or photographed in the way that we have. I think one of the original things about this book is the way in which we've made such an effort to relate the costumes to their environment. We realized early on this was essential to demonstrate the way in which regional differences have led to regional styles and materials used in costumes. And I think that's been both a challenge because we've sort of almost had to make it up as we go along, but that's meant that we've created a book which I think is unlike any other, and that's something that I think we can all be very proud about.
Hopefully a seed to grow on.
Exactly.
That's a good forward-looking point at which to end. I'll just repeat for anyone who is interested. There are links to the book in the chat channel if you would like to follow those up. There's also a link to the Mansujet Foundation website where you can see a great deal more about the foundation. I would like to thank all of the members of the Mansujet Foundation, Hamida and Richard Wilding in particular, for making this event possible and giving us such an insightful and fabulously illustrated talk. I would also like to thank all of you in our audience, particularly the very many of you who are new to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, and I hope we may see you again before too long. We have a number of events scheduled in the coming months that will continue to explore the role of heritage and cultural identity. At the end of this month, Anchal Malhotra will be talking about the significance of cultural artifacts for those displaced by the partition of India. And from the autumn of this year, we're planning a series of events addressing the importance of heritage in international development work. So please look out for those. But our next event is straightforwardly political. On the 16th of June, Ben Bland from the Lowy Institute in Australia will be talking on the subject, Leading Indonesia in Troubled Times, Jokowi's Remarkable Rise. And joining him on a conversation on that topic will be Sir Richard Gosney, the UK's ambassador to Indonesia in 2000 to 2004. I hope that we will see many of you at that event too. In the meantime, thank you all once again, and goodbye until then.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.